Mom, stop texting me every week like I owe you a response. I have a life. That's what my son said to me, and then for 8 straight years he made good on it. He didn't call. He didn't visit. He didn't answer a single message unless he needed something. What none of my 3 children knew is that while they were busy ghosting their mother, I was quietly ghosting them right out of everything I owned. My name is Eleanor Hastings. I'm 72 years old, and I've lived in Nashville, Tennessee my whole life. Before I tell you what I finally did, I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Drop your city or state in the comments below. I always wonder who's out there listening to a story like mine. Now let me take you back to where all of this started. I married my husband Frank when I was 22 years old. He worked in construction his whole life, started as a laborer, hauling lumber for $6 an hour, and worked his way up until he owned his own small contracting company by the time he was 40. I worked as a nurse for 35 years at Vanderbilt, mostly night shifts, so I could be home during the day with our 3 children sleeping in stolen 2- and 3-hour blocks for most of my 30s and 40s. We weren't rich, not by any stretch, but we were steady. We paid our bills on time. We saved every extra dollar we could into a coffee can Frank kept on top of the refrigerator before we finally trusted a bank enough to open a real savings account. We bought a modest brick ranch house in a neighborhood that back then was considered the outer edge of the city dirt roads and empty lots as far as you could see. And we raised our kids in that house with everything we had in us. Rebecca was our oldest born when I was 24 sharp and driven even as a little girl, the kind of child who organized her stuffed animals alphabetically. Todd came 2 years after her, quieter, always building something with his hands following Frank around the garage from the time he could walk. And Kayla, our baby, arrived when I was 34. A surprise we welcomed with open arms, even though Frank and I had thought we were done having children the light of both our lives, from her very first breath. I was the room mother every single year, all 3 grades running at once some years. I sewed Rebecca's Halloween costumes by hand, staying up past midnight more than once to finish a hem. I drove Todd to baseball practice 5 days a week for a decade, my van smelling permanently of grass stains and Gatorade. I sat up all night with Kayla when she had chickenpox reading to her until her fever finally broke around 3 in the morning. I didn't just raise those children. I was present for every single day of their lives that mattered, every recital, every scraped knee, every 2 a.m. fever. Frank died on a Tuesday morning in April 11th years ago. He was 66 years old. He'd been complaining about being tired for a few weeks, but he waved it off the way stubborn men do. He collapsed while loading his truck for a job site. Massive heart attack. The paramedics tried for 35 minutes. I watched every second of it from our front porch, and then he was gone. The funeral was packed, over 200 people, because Frank had built half the neighborhoods in that part of Nashville, and everybody had a story about him helping them out with a job or a loan they never had to pay back. My 3 children stood beside me at that funeral, and Rebecca held my hand the whole time and said, "Mom, we've got you. We're not going anywhere." I believed her completely. For the first year after Frank died, my kids were good to me. They called regularly. They stopped by with groceries. Todd mowed the lawn every Saturday the way his father used to. Kayla called me every morning just to check in. I thought this is what family does. We hold each other up when everything falls apart. If you've ever believed your own children when they promised they'd always be there and then watched that promise quietly dissolve, I want to know. Tell me in the comments what that felt like for you. And if this story is landing so far, please hit that subscribe button. It helps me keep sharing stories like mine with all of you. Then slowly the calls started thinning out. Year 1 turned into year 2, and Rebecca's weekly calls became twice a month. She'd gotten a promotion at her law firm, and her life had gotten busier, she said. I understood. I told myself that's what happens when children build their own lives. Year 3. Todd moved his family across town, and what used to be a 15-minute drive to see me became 45 minutes with traffic. "It's just so far now, Mom," he'd say. "We'll come by soon." Soon kept stretching. Year 4. Kayla got engaged to a man named Brandon who worked in finance, and between the wedding planning and her new job, our lunches together dropped to once every couple of months, then once a season. I want you to understand I didn't fight any of this loudly. I adjusted. I stopped expecting the daily calls. I stopped assuming I'd be included in every little thing. I told myself this was normal, that children grow up and grow apart a little, and that as long as the love was still there underneath, I could live with the distance. Year 5 is when things changed in a way I couldn't just adjust to anymore. I had a small stroke in March, what the doctors called a TIA, a warning stroke. I was alone in my kitchen when it happened, my left hand suddenly numb, my words slurring when I tried to call for help. I managed to dial 911 myself. They kept me overnight at Vanderbilt for observation, in the very hospital I'd worked in for over 3 decades. From that hospital bed, I called Rebecca first. Straight to voicemail. I called Todd. Same thing. I called Kayla. Nothing. I left messages on all 3 telling them where I was, what had happened, trying to keep my voice steady so I wouldn't sound as frightened as I actually was. Rebecca texted back 4 hours later. "Oh my gosh, Mom, that's scary. Glad you're okay. Work has been insane. Call you tomorrow." She didn't call the next day. Todd texted 2 words. "Get well." Kayla didn't respond until the following afternoon. "Sorry, been swamped with wedding stuff. You're okay though, right?" I lay in that hospital bed alone all night, listening to machines beep in the dark, and something in me went very quiet. If you've ever needed the people who raised you to need the people you raised and heard nothing but silence back, I want to know how that felt for you. And if this story is helping you feel less alone, that's exactly why I keep telling these stories every week. After the hospital, I started paying closer attention, really paying attention, instead of making excuses for them in my head, the way I'd been doing for years. When I did manage to get one of them on the phone, the conversations had a pattern I couldn't unsee anymore. Rebecca would ask how I was doing, then quickly pivot. Mom did. Dad ever set up a trust for the house? I've been meaning to ask. Todd started bringing up estate planning out of nowhere, telling me I really should get everything organized to make things easier down the road. Kayla more than once mentioned how big the house was for just me, how much upkeep it must take, how nice it would be if I simplified. I realized slowly and then all at once that their occasional check-ins weren't really about me anymore. They were about what I had. The house paid off years ago had tripled in value since Frank and I bought it. My investments, careful and modest as they'd always been, had grown steadily over 40 years of never touching them. I was worth considerably more than any of my children realized, and once they started sensing that their attention came with strings attached that had nothing to do with love. Year 6. My text to them started going completely unanswered. Not delayed, unanswered. I'd send Rebecca a photo of something that reminded me of her father, an old tool of his I'd found in the garage, a photo from one of his job sites. Nothing back. I'd text Todd on his birthday the same message I'd sent him every year since he could read. Nothing. I'd invite Kayla to lunch 3 separate times over 3 months, offering to drive to wherever was convenient for her. Nothing until she'd resurface weeks later with a casual, "Hey, been so busy." As if no time had passed at all, as if I hadn't spent 3 separate Saturdays sitting alone at a restaurant table with a menu I never opened. I stopped being invited to things I used to be central to. I found out about my grandson's baseball championship through a photo on Facebook weeks after it happened. Todd's wife tagged in the comments, me nowhere in sight. I found out Kayla and Brandon had bought a new house through a mutual friend at church, not from Kayla herself, learning the address of my own daughter's home secondhand over coffee hour. I sat at my kitchen table on my 70th birthday, a cake I'd baked myself sitting untouched on the counter because there was no one to share it with candles I never bothered lighting, and not one of my 3 children called. Doris next door noticed before I let myself admit it out loud. She'd wave from her porch most mornings, and one day in early summer, she asked gently, when was the last time all 3 of my kids had been under my roof at once? I had to think about it for a long, uncomfortable moment before I realized I genuinely couldn't remember. Year 7. My neighbor, a sweet woman named Doris, had a bad fall and broke her hip, and I watched her family show up for her every single day, bringing meals, driving her to appointments, sitting with her in the evenings. I sat on my porch watching all of that, and felt something I'm not proud of, a deep, aching envy for a woman recovering from a broken bone, because at least she had people showing up. That was the year I finally called my lawyer. His name is Walter Griggs, and he'd handled Frank's estate 11 years earlier. Good man, direct, no nonsense. I sat in his office and told him everything: the hospital stay, the unanswered texts, the sudden interest in the house whenever they did surface. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he leaned back and said, "Eleanor, let's talk about what you actually want your legacy to look like, separate from what you assumed it would look like." Over the following months, Walter and I restructured everything. We met 5 separate times, going through every account, every document, every scenario. First, I removed all 3 of my children as primary beneficiaries of my will. Walter warned me they could contest it. "Let them try," I told him. "I've got 8 years of texts and voicemails that speak for themselves." We divided my estate a different way. 35% to the American Heart Association in Frank's memory, because his heart had given out too soon, and I wanted his name attached to something that might help another family keep theirs a little longer. 30% to the Nashville Nursing Scholarship Fund, because 35 years of nursing had shaped my entire life, and I wanted to hand that path forward to some young woman who needed it. 25% split evenly among my 5 grandchildren, held in trust until they turned 28, with a simple condition attached that they maintain a genuine relationship with me, defined clearly in the trust language as regular visits or phone calls logged and acknowledged, not obligatory holiday check-ins performed for optics. The remaining 10% went to Doris, who had, without even realizing it, shown me more consistent kindness in 1 year than my children had shown me in the last 8. We moved the house into an irrevocable trust with me as the lifetime beneficiary. Upon my death, it would be sold proceeds going straight to the charities I'd named. My children would receive nothing from it directly. Walter made sure it was airtight structured so it couldn't be challenged later, no matter what story anyone tried to tell a judge, walking me through every possible avenue of contest and closing each one methodically, the same careful, patient way he'd once handled Frank's estate. Then I did one more thing. I quietly went through 8 years of my phone, screenshotting every unanswered text, every voicemail that went straight to nothing, every casual dismissal, and I had it all printed and dated and organized in a folder Walter kept in his office just in case. For nearly a year after that, life was quiet. I didn't tell my children anything had changed, mostly because there was nothing to tell them. They weren't calling, so there was no one to inform. I started actually living instead of waiting. I joined a quilting group at my church. I started volunteering 2 mornings a week at the same hospital where I'd worked for 3 decades this time, just rocking newborns in the NICU who needed someone to hold them. I made real friends, women who wanted to sit with me because they enjoyed my company, not because they were quietly waiting to see what I'd leave behind. Then, almost exactly 8 years to the month after Frank died, everything changed again. Rebecca called me out of nowhere on a Tuesday evening. "Mom, I've been thinking about you so much lately. We should really get together, all of us, like old times." I nearly laughed out loud. Old times hadn't existed in nearly a decade. "Why now?" I asked her plainly. There was a pause, and then the real reason came tumbling out. Todd's brother-in-law worked at the courthouse and had mentioned in passing that Frank's old contracting business partner had recently sold his share of a commercial property they'd co-owned decades ago for an enormous sum, a property Frank had also had a stake in before he died. Suddenly, my children had done the math. Suddenly, they remembered they had a mother. Would you have picked up that phone and told them the truth right then? Or would you have let them keep guessing the way I did? I'd love to know in the comments. And if you've ever watched people suddenly remember you exist the moment money enters the conversation, please hit that subscribe button, because what happens next is exactly what they deserve to hear. I invited all 3 of them to the house for Sunday dinner, the first time in 8 years all 3 had been under my roof at the same time. I cooked everything myself the way I used to. I set the table with Frank's mother's china. And when they arrived, hugging me like nothing had happened, complimenting the house, asking careful circling questions about how I'd been managing everything, I let them eat first. I let them get comfortable. Then, I brought out the folder. I laid it on the table between the mashed potatoes and the green beans. 8 years of screenshots dated and organized exactly the way Walter had filed them, a thickness that visibly startled all 3 of them the moment they saw it. "Before we eat dessert," I said, keeping my voice as level and pleasant as if I were discussing the weather, "I want to go over a few things." I read them 3 of their own messages aloud in their own words, the ones that had gone silent for weeks, the ones that had arrived 4 hours late from a hospital bed, the one where Kayla had written, "Sorry, been swamped" for the 4th time, running each identical excuse laid bare next to the last, until the pattern became impossible for any of them to deny or explain away. Rebecca reached for the folder herself, flipping through a few pages, her hand slightly unsteady landing on a printed screenshot from the night of my stroke, time-stamped 11:47 p.m. Her own reply from the following afternoon still glowing faintly on the page. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Rebecca's face went white. Todd started to say something about being busy about their own lives, the same excuses I'd been swallowing for 8 years, and I simply held up my hand. "I already know," I said. "I lived it. I have it all written down." I told them calmly exactly what I'd done. The trust, the will, the conditions attached to their own children's inheritance, not theirs. I told them the house would never be theirs to inherit, that it would go to the causes that had actually shown up in my life while they hadn't. Todd stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "You can't do this to us," he said. "We're your children." I looked at him and said the truest thing I've ever said in my life. "You stopped acting like my children 8 years ago. I'm just the one who finally noticed." Kayla was crying the same performative tears she'd used since she was a little girl trying to get out of trouble, and for the first time in my life, they didn't move me at all. Rebecca, to her credit, didn't cry or shout. She just sat very still, staring at that folder, and said quietly, "We really did that, didn't we?" It wasn't quite an apology. It was closer to one than anything the other 2 managed that night. They left without dessert. Rebecca called 2 days later, her voice small, and asked if we could talk. Really talk, not about money, about what had actually happened between us. I told her I needed time. I still do. It's been 6 months since that dinner, and I've spoken to Rebecca twice. Careful, honest conversations that feel like they might someday become something real again. Todd hasn't called. Kayla sent one long email about how hurt she was that I'd kept records like she was a criminal, which told me everything I still needed to know about whether she understood what she'd done. I'm not going to sit here and tell you this ends with a perfect family reunion, because it doesn't, and I promised myself a long time ago I'd only ever tell you the truth in these stories. Some days I grieve the family I thought I had, the one I spent decades believing I was building brick by brick right alongside that little ranch house. Most days, I'm simply grateful for the one I've built since Doris on my porch every morning, with her arthritic hands wrapped around a coffee mug, the nurses at the NICU who save me a rocking chair every Tuesday and Thursday without fail, the quilting circle that shows up rain or shine, women who ask about my week and actually wait to hear the answer. I gave my children everything I had for decades, every sleepless night, every dollar I could spare, every ounce of myself, and when I finally needed a fraction of that back, they were too busy for me. So I stopped waiting by a phone that wasn't going to ring, and I built a life that doesn't require their permission or their presence to be full. I'm Eleanor Hastings. I'm 72 years old, and after 8 years of being ghosted by my own children, I finally stopped waiting by the phone and started living the life that was actually mine.